Trees and forests are sacred. Without them, you would not have life. If you don't believe me, try a little experiment and hold your breath for a half an hour. Then you'll see.
What is it about forests that so captivates us? They permeate our stories, our myths, our science, and our ways of living. I'm Jessica J. Lee, and in Under the Canopy, a series for the Compass on BBC World Service, I want to explore all the things a forest can be, from the terrifying to the beautiful, to the comforting, to places lived and worked in for generations, and places unknown and seemingly wild and wonderfully disorienting.
Look over your shoulder at where you've been. The edge of the wood can no longer be seen. Vast is the forest, and slender your track. Harder it grows to find your way back.
A while back, I read that there are more trees on Earth than there are stars in the sky. Might there be just as many ways of thinking about forests? From folklore to science, to forests as places of desire and places of labor that sustain livelihoods. I guess the biggest question I want to ask is, how do we capture that feeling of standing beneath the trees, which I'm doing right now, sort of in a clearing of oak trees. And it's just a feeling that really brings me into my ears. The sounds of, wood moving and birds singing. It's incredibly sensory. I want to capture the sense, the sounds, and that feeling of being beneath the canopy.
Sounds come up and out of Nick's mouth. Syllables that mean, loosely, "Oh, my hopeless Jesus." He has seen monster trees for weeks, but never one like this.
There isn't just one story to tell about forests. I grew up on picture books about, badgers wearing proper clothes, having very human adventures with other woodland creatures, and a version of Goldilocks that mysteriously was set not in a forest of bears, but rather in a Hawaiian jungle full of mongooses. As an adult, I find that the forest points me towards something vital and difficult to put into words. It continues to fascinate me, as it does other writers like Richard Powers, whose Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Overstory, really captures this feeling of confronting the sublime in forests.
I was teaching at Stanford, Northern California, and it's a peculiar spot of Earth. On the one side of a very narrow peninsula is Silicon Valley, and this incredible go-go culture of people who are intoxicated on the idea that they've created the present and they are now in the process of creating the future. And to get away from this often unbounded optimism, I would go up into the Santa Cruz Mountains. And up there you have extraordinary second growth redwood that have come back in 100 years from forests that were cut down to build San Francisco. And the moment for me, the epiphany moment, was walking through what I thought were spectacularly, immense and old creatures, and then coming across a real giant, a last remnant of the original forest. And when you see a tree that's wider than a house and taller than a football pitch is long and as old as Jesus, it's hard not to have a moment of awakening. And the course of writing this novel was an exercise in finding ways of making something that operates on such a profoundly different scale of size and time palpable as something that has its own purpose and its own story.
And it isn't always easy to qualify or quantify all the things, all the wonder we may confront in the forest, even for those who've spent their lives with trees.
My name is Peter Wohleben. I'm a forester and an author of several books about nature, about forests, of course.
Knowing what you do about forests then and knowing the science, are you able to go into the forest and still just experience that almost childlike sense of wonder, I think?
That's exactly the question I asked myself during school time. When it comes to the topic of love, I thought, if the biology teacher knows everything about how this works biochemically and so on, then the wonder is destroyed. But that's exactly what nature isn't. Nature isn't a machine. You can just scratch on the surface and explain some major things, but all those little wonders I think we will never explain. And I see it every day. We work together with a lot of scientists, and they are researching and detecting so many very important things, but all those lovely things about communications, about caring for each other, about resilience, about how strong trees are and how peaceful. Yeah, that's every day a little wonder to me. And while we are talking here, I'm looking at an old birch tree in front of my house, which is exactly 88 years old, and it's full of holes and rotten inside, and every storm I think now it will break. Oh no. And no, it's withstanding. I don't know how this tree does that. It's so strong, it's so wonderful. So every day is a wonder.
There's still mystery in it for you.
It's still a mystery, yeah.
Great. The forests in my life have been all over the world. In Canada, where I was born, and in Taiwan, where my mother's from, amidst these 1,000-year-old cypresses and cedars. But I've actually spent most of my time in the pine forests of Germany, in a place that almost demands thinking about fairy tales and idyllic forests, but also much darker truths. There's a part in Simon Schama's Landscape and Memory where he writes that in the lead-up to the Second World War, forest themes invaded virtually every realm of art and politics in Germany. Woodland heritage was seen as essential to national identity, so much so that the Third Reich went about protecting enormous swathes of forest across the country. You have a sort of eco-romanticism mingling with fascism to tragic effect. So even now, to speak about German landscape, to speak about the forests, it's laden with political and historical undercurrents. So I'm standing in the middle of a pine forest, which is right next to the forest cemetery in Halbe, about 40 kilometers south of Berlin. And I'm standing sort of in this open glade of Scots pine trees. The forest in Halbe is one of these strange places that I think sort of disrupts even my own ideas of this beautiful and comfortable and idyllic forest. Essentially, in the last days of the Second World War, one of the major final battles of the war took place around here. And in the years afterwards, they were finding bodies in this forest, just in the tens of thousands. And in the forest cemetery sort of next door to here, there's over 28,000 people buried, soldiers and civilians. And it's just one of those places that I think makes me a bit uneasy. They still have full-time staff here scouring the forest to look for remains. And so I guess, when I come to this forest, it undoes my idea of this sort of beautiful, serene place of comfort, I guess, and solitude. It feels haunted, and it feels, I guess, just uneasy is the best way to put it.
Nothing. Say your prayers and be good too. Oh, dead Papa Toothwort is coming for you.
He wants to kill things, so he sings.
Coming for you.
Dark undercurrents of a different kind are at play in Max Porter's novel Lanny.
Shut it, you.
Featuring his myth man of the woods, dead Papa Toothwort.
He chucks the bird across the forest floor and stamps his feet. He clomps through the woods, wide awake and hungry.
Look at this. It's a proper myth tree, that, isn't it? There's a witch buried in there or something, isn't there? The woods. It's my default place of worship. There's a few places I go swimming in the river, in the woods. And that thing of having trees over you, almost like being in a holloway but floating on your back in the river is as close as I get to heaven on earth.
Max, in your writing, I've actually seen somewhere that you had said that you could, if you could be any kind of writer, you would want to be a 12th century forest balladeer.
I guess there is a romantic escapism involved in thinking I might like to just walk around, arriving in places, telling stories, meeting different people, changing those stories from place to place to please or disquiet or entertain different groups of people, and that way might be a kind of modulation of ideas in the community of living things, like an idea passing through a forest.
But this is, I mean, one of the things we've been thinking about a lot. You know, I'm stood in a German forest, which come with so much baggage, I guess, of fairy tales and German romanticism and then fascism. And I think the sort of ideas of recouping the forests here are quite different than perhaps some of the background to forests in Britain.
Well, I think that in the same way as one has to think about the forest as the sort of home or the birthplace of, for example, the Grimm fairy tales, I think in the UK one cannot really talk about the woods without talking about class, because the landowners or monarchs or indeed globalised corporations or universities that own the forest and deforested this country, it's ironic that the idea of the forest is a place of escapism from some of the less pleasant facets of our modern political history, because in fact it was the ground upon which those battles were fought. So this is both a refuge from the contemporary political world and a place where contemporary political battlegrounds are staked and fought. And I'm just reading a book about Irish tree law, and of course the woods that exist in Ireland are the woods on the estates of English invaders and landowners, because they cut down all the forest in Ireland. And then the keeping of ancient forest wisdom and the telling of stories about the woods and the healing properties of specific trees became, as it were, underground knowledge, rebel knowledge, resistance knowledge. And that therefore gives it a radical purpose, a radical intent, a radical possibility that is now, ironically, at the sort of forefront of modern science. So I think to keep politics out of it is a mistake. But the forests I write about really come from my upbringing. I grew up about an hour and a half outside London, and that's beechwood territory. So my default forest...
Your forest.
Yeah, my forest, exactly, thank you, is an English beechwood. Often when I'm driving around this part of the world, I'll always be pulling over my car and going, "Oh, boys," to my sons, "look at that old oak tree," or, "look at that unbelievable line of copper beeches along that road," or whatever it is, or huge cherry trees, or even, the evergreens. And it's always on private land. It's always in these huge estates. And so explaining to my children the relationship between owned land and cared for land, and that actually the idea of the wild wood is obviously a hotly contested idea now.
Yeah. Sorry, to go back, I'm actually really struck by this image of you pulling over in the car with your kids. There's a real, forest dad energy to that.
I bore them horribly, and I embarrass them, because, I want to hug and lick and be with trees in a way that is not cool when you're 10 years old and your dad's standing by the family citron hugging a birch.
And if we move from the English greenwood with its ancient forest law to the forests of the Pyrenees, that for the writer Ginny Ready became a place of encounter and confrontation with something seemingly more than human, something other, perhaps even magical.
There was a period in my life when I got very interested in doing these deep, immersive wilderness quests. You go into the natural world for a number of days with few possessions, sometimes nothing at all, and you just sit within a circle of a few feet and you don't move about very much. And I went on one of these in the Pyrenees to connect with this idea of a living but non-human, sentient, animate nature. But you have to be careful what you wish for. So I was high atop this mountain. I think it was called Hartzamendi, and it was a sacred peak. And I was surrounded by these ferns, and beyond them was this dense forest. And the guide who'd walked me up here, as he was leaving, he'd said, "See that forest over there? The Yeti lives in there. Bye.
Oh my goodness.
See you in 5 days." And when the sun set, I felt really scared. I felt scared of the darkness. I felt scared of what might be out there. I was afraid of this forest adjacent to me. And then suddenly everything went really quiet. All the night sounds went really quiet. And the hairs stood up on the back of my neck. And I could hear this voice on the other side of the tent. And it was this, unearthly, disembodied whisper. And yet there had been no footsteps, no crackling of branches. And I woke up the next morning and I felt fine, the sun was out, but I kept looking at this forest adjacent to me day after day, and I thought, I have to go into this forest. I can't just look at it and feel afraid of this forest. And so in the end, I forced myself to go and sit in that forest, and suddenly this shadow appeared in the trees, and I was terrified, and my heart began to hammer, and the shadow moved, and it turned out to be a wild horse. And I was so relieved. And then I could stay in that forest. And I stayed for a little longer. And what I learned was that if you sit with your fear for long enough, and if you allow yourself to feel it and you don't push it away, it dissolves. And ever since that time, whenever I've been in any kind of woods or forest, I have noticed that I feel completely at ease.
I think my first memory of a forest is not of a proper forest, but was my backyard. I grew up in a suburb called Pine Ridge in southwestern Ontario, and behind all the houses, our backyards backed onto this grove of pine trees, which I now think about as sort of huge, as hundreds and hundreds of trees that stretched for miles, but actually I think it was less than 500 meters squared. We used to play there as kids, play hide and seek behind the trees, and it was a space that I spent so much time as a kid. I didn't feel any lack as a child thinking about this little grove in my backyard. It felt like a proper forest to me. Yeah, I do wonder, it's like as we grow older, do we stop allowing that to be enough?
So much of a forest is psychological and emotional, so that it can only be a small stand of trees. But if that is something that makes you feel as if you're somehow isolated and in a more natural space, then maybe that is a forest. And then I think there's the forest we all carry around inside us as well.
Oh, that's lovely.
Sort of hidden secrets or things that who knows what might emerge from it, and, exciting and maybe not so exciting. Mm-hmm.
There's a line at the start of Roger Deacon's book Wildwood that I keep coming back to. To enter a wood is to pass into a different world in which we ourselves are transformed. It's a sentiment that resonates too with poet Carl Phillips. You talk about there being sort of always trees of literature floating around in your head. Which are the ones that sort of haunt you and that you carry?
I tend to think of the things that I read younger. Lord of the Rings, the Narnia Chronicles, and fairy tales too. You have children or otherwise naive and optimistic people, part of whose courage is that they don't think to be afraid, and who trust that shrouding nature of forests can be protective, and it can be, but other people are being protected, or creatures who could be dangerous to oneself. Woodland landscapes have seemed a kind of testing ground often for innocence.
You write about forests as queer spaces, as spaces for cruising, but also spaces for subversion, for sort of sheltering, but also sort of allowing, right? So there's this play between shame and fear, but also a sense of absolution, I guess, that the forests can offer.
I like that idea, especially to go straight to the idea of cruising. I found that although part of it was the potential danger, the edge, which makes things exciting, what surprised me is the strange amount of trust and intimacy that can happen between people in that space. It's almost as if the forest erases our normal moral guideposts, maybe, but I don't know. There is a weird way in which the forest seems to take on its own moral energy. At least I've found that to be so. I also know horrible things happen in forests. People are murdered, bodies are disposed of. So there's also that.
I think psychologically they're incredibly fascinating. They are the other. They're the dark where our desires might be met, and they're the dark where we may be annihilated.
This is the writer Melissa Harrison.
The fact that we can't really decide one way or the other, we can't reduce forests down in our imagination, is what makes them continually powerful. It's what means that we can't quite leave them alone, I think.
Over your shoulder, at where you've been, the edge of the wood can no longer be seen. Vast is the forest and slender track. Harder it grows to find your way back.
In fairy tales, forests are magical and quite frightening as well. They're places where the unexpected happens, and they're places where outlaws go. When you are cast out of society, you go and live in the forest, and there are witches there, and bandits, and fairies, and all of the things that we don't have room for in our ordinary, everyday, modern lives. That's where we put them.
One of the things that we've been struggling with in thinking about this documentary also is I guess the complexity, right? So I wonder, maybe, is there a sense of us losing something if we over sentimentalize or sanitize woods and forests? Do we need this spaciousness in how we think about them?
I think what's necessary to being a full, well-rounded human being, if I may make such a bold statement, is wilderness, is an interior wilderness. I think that we're groomed to get rid of that. So for me, the forest, for example, I think it's no surprise that cruising happens there, because it's going to happen somewhere where society isn't able to see clearly what's going on. It's a space within which, I guess, to give in to what the body wants to do, knowing that we're told this is illegal or immoral in some way or sinful. To me, that's the danger of a sanitized landscape. Life isn't, to me, about always staying on a path, but sort of finding out what can happen if we get lost for a moment. But being lost is considered a bad state. Mm-hmm. And yet it doesn't have to be. It can be the space where we start to learn things that, we didn't expect. So in that sense, I think of a forest as a counterpoint, I suppose, to how our lives are much more landscaped. And it's one thing to landscape the actual land, but when you start landscaping and giving unnatural shape to how people think or behave, that seems more problematic to me.
The Fern Ticket 1 by Zakia Mackenzie. A taboo so sweet, a myth so endearing, a lover's retreat, a comfortable clearing, where prying eyes need not inquire, far from the church spire, here where only nature intrudes, and lovers do the things they do, within the folds of thick forest, beneath the branches where birds and bees nest, they share together nature's delight, with woodland cover and sunlight, in rhythm with rain, in motion with moon, to give and take, to enjoy the bloom, to dance for days and to love with it. Come with amour, here lies the fern ticket.
I almost feel as if forests are suspect these days. We live in a society of surveillance, and anything that's not able to be sort of broken down, deconstructed, and parsed is somehow threatening. And I think this is the problem with all difference. I think racial difference is almost like a forest for people. It's frightening. Blackness, in particular, is frightening for, I'd say, a lot of white people. And it seems like an impenetrable forest. And I think the human impulse is to clear that forest, rather than to say, let's enter, let's engage with it. So I had no idea I was going to wax contemporary, but there I am.
What is the forest in you? You speak about, having a wilderness in all of us. Could you tell me a bit about what that wilderness is, about that forest?
To me, the wilderness somehow includes sexual curiosity, risk-taking, also just the impulse to do things that are forbidden, to suddenly start screaming because you want to, but you realize you shouldn't, probably because you're in a library. All of those things that I think are in the forest and sometimes come to light deliberately and sometimes just come to light unexpectedly, and we had no idea we had that in us. In fact, I think that's exactly it. When people surprise themselves by something they end up being ashamed of, or they surprise themselves by their own courage. So all of that is part of wilderness for me.
So the forest can hold all of that, which is really powerful to think.
I think so, yeah.
As much as walking the forest feels like a journey inward, if I look closely at individual trees, at mosses and lichen and fungi, at soil, then I'm invited to think beyond myself, beyond a human timescale, to think about forests as living, breathing entanglements. And among the trees of a London park with Richard Powers, he spoke of the same search for multiplicity that forests offer through the particular and the singular.
A certain kind of attention will keep you present to the knowledge that this spot is a moment of history among multiple trajectories, social and non-human. And you may not be able to untangle those trajectories. You may not be able to clearly see how we arrived at this lovely copse of Quercus robur, but you are at least tuned into the fact that you're looking at an ephemeral thing in a very long unfolding process of time.